Good evening, everybody. My name's Philip Yen. I will be your moderator this evening. We have a very important topic to discuss that is extremely fascinating, and I'll just briefly say this. When I first got the topic, I understand what it means: income inequality, inclusiveness, investment implementation. But as I researched more and more of it, many articles from the OECD, the more confused I got. The more I found myself asking the question is it working, and what are we trying to accomplish, and who are we trying to help? And why is it not working better? And I didn't have an answer to that. So I went from confident about the topic to less confident. I had a chance to meet many of our speakers a bit earlier, and I can tell you that my confidence has grown, that we will have an inspiring discussion, little fireworks, expecting that out of you, Phil. Martin's going to give us some extraordinary perspective when it comes to the financial crisis, and of course we have some extremely influential people up here as well, and I will get to that introduction in just a bit. But on behalf of the OECD, thank you very much for being here. I trust this topic is as important to you as it is to us. The format will go like this. I will introduce the speakers, and then I will ask each of them to make a very brief comment as to why this is both personally and professionally important to them. And it will not be 20 minutes. They will give a 1 to 2 minute sort of just a brief remark for a chance for you to see how they feel about this particular topic. G20, inclusiveness, investment, and implementation. So here we go. Thank you again to our guests and to our speakers. Our first speaker is Kavit Dagdas, the Acting Undersecretary of the Treasury for Turkey and also the Finance Deputy to the G20. We also have with us Ms. Gabriela Ramos, Chief of Staff to the OECD and Sherpa to the G20. I'm told you're quite powerful, so I'm a little nervous. I'm a little intimidated. And she's even got the power dress on as well, so I'm sweating. Thank you for being here. Thank you. We have with us Phil O'Reilly, Chair of the BIAC, essentially the New Zealand Business Association. Thank you again for being here. You'll be one of our important voices. You might get some tough questions, but I think you can handle that. And of course, Sharon Burrell, General Secretary, International Trade Union Confederation. We had a nice conversation earlier. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, somebody who many of you most likely know if you've been following this particular topic, or any topic for that matter regarding the financial crisis, Mr. Martin Wolf, the Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator for the FT, the Financial Times, who has gone on the record a number of times with controversial statements, so I expect nothing less of that. Martin, it's good to see you. Thank you. Let me start with a brief statement regarding the question I asked earlier, and I'll start with the Acting Undersecretary of Treasury of Turkey. Why is the topic of inclusiveness, equality, the implementation of it, why is it personally important to you, sir?
Thank you very much. Let me start with our mottos this year, 3 I's: investment, implementation, and inclusiveness. This motto mainly stems from the existing work of G20. Remember last year, the Australian presidency put an ambitious target for in 5 years, we will have 2 percentage point higher growth rate if we implement all the structural reforms committed by the G20 members. And this year, we said, okay, let's do it. So we have to implement. So the implementation comes from the commitment from the G20 members. But if we reach 2% higher growth rate in 2018, it should be inclusive. It should be also investment driven, so that the three I's mainly stems from these basic existing work. What we mean that we had over 1,200 structural reform commitments that the G20 members made. So how we monitor it? This is the problem. So that we asked all G20 members to consolidate the structural reform agenda, but it should be country-owned and country-led priorities for structural reforms. And we have prepared a template for this, endorsed by the ministers in Washington, D.C. So we are now our working group is focusing on getting information from all G20 members, and first report will be released on September or so we are expecting. So that we are in G20, we are closely monitoring the structural reforms committed to our G20, which is very important issue that all the day we discuss this structural reforms importance. It should be inclusive. Inclusiveness have two aspects: domestically inclusiveness, internationally inclusiveness. So that domestically we put the SMEs on the top of the agenda, gender and youth employment on the top of the agenda. These are the cross-sectional priorities for G20. And for international inclusiveness, we are trying to integrate least developed countries into the world economy. This is a very crucial issue too. So that we are getting 2% higher growth rate, and it's gonna be inclusive domestically and inclusive internationally. So the investment is main driven because we all know that there's a huge investment gap, both infrastructure and private sector. So we are trying to find a way to attract the private sector in infrastructure, mainly PPP models. And they have asked our members to prepare their investment strategies, not for the target just for the target for investment, but with the facilitators, policies, and safeguards too. So let me stop here and then come back again if you have any other questions.
We have lots of questions. Mr. Undersecretary, thank you. Ms. Ramos, same question to you. Personally to you, why is this topic so important?
Well, if you want my very personal comment, is just that with the increase of inequalities that we have seen and the fact that the concentration of wealth has really got into levels that is unsustainable, first, of course, you need to have some kind of empathy for those people that are not making their end meet and to not be able even to find the jobs to take care of their families. But beyond that, remember what happened this morning when we presented the economic outlook. We have been saying the recovery has been very slow. There is very high unemployment. The legacies of the crisis are still with us. And one of the major concerns that the OECD has been documenting is what is happening with the productivity growth that was one of the anchors that our economies had to create higher levels of wealth and better living conditions for the people. And so connecting that agenda of boosting higher growth for a more sustainable recovery with the question of inequality, and we have in the audience the experts of this topic, you can find that they are very interlinked. You will not be able to have higher levels of growth if 40% of the population is left behind. You would not be able to really take full advantage of all the potential that that population has, and more in the context of aging, if you do not allow for them to have access to an acceptable level of income. But not only that, what we have also found is that it is not only the question of inequality of income, but inequality of opportunities. Those that are at the bottom of the income distribution probably have less access to quality education and less access to quality health. So I feel that we are just wasting the potential to really have all these people investing in themselves and to create an environment that is not only providing us with the stronger growth, but also that will allow to have a sustainable growth, because socially is neither sustainable. So that's why I think it's rather important that the Turkish presidency had put this accent into the question of inclusiveness. And we're ready to help, because we have been the organization that had been documenting all these worrisome trends in the advanced economies. Let's not even get into the question of what happened with the emerging economies, which has not managed to get the level of social safety nets that we have, for example, in France.
We're going to do our best to help move this forward. Thank you. Ms. Burrow, you've spent a career in trying to help those who may not be able to help themselves and those less fortunate. What does this mean to you?
Well, Gabriella has given you a description of the growing inequality and the moral purpose that we should all feel passionate about to change the face of an economy that's not delivering for people. But I represent working people, so let me just tell you what the global workforce looks like. 2.9 billion people, give or take, 1 or 2 or 3. The 60% of them in the in the formal economy, as we say, where they're supposed to have some form of employment contract of security, but more than 50% of those actually increasingly in vulnerable work, and indeed 40% of their brothers and sisters, those who are in the jobs crisis of unemployment, those who are desperate, who are migrants, desperate for a living in the informal sector where there are no rights, no minimum wages, no social protection, and indeed that sector's growing, and 30 million or so of our brothers and sisters enslaved in modern-day slavery in areas like the Gulf states and other countries. We know that this is not a workforce that is just or humane, but it's not, and as Angel Gurria said yesterday, it's not the basis for a more humane global economy. So if we're going to turn that around, we have to understand that people have lost trust. For me, that's personal. I meet with them, I see their despair, I go to the factories, I talk to the women like Rina in the Philippines, who tells you that she can't tell her 12-year-old son whether she will be cooking him a meal that night or even see him, because she's forced to do overtime. She can get home at 8, 10, 12, 2, 4 in the morning, or indeed work all night, often without food for a voucher that a canteen doesn't open till 6. These supply chains are the dominant model now of global trade, and people simply are losing trust in business. I can give you the figures very quickly that say that when we polled the people globally last year, 60% of people said that they didn't trust business could look after workers. We just did a poll in 9 countries, more than 50% of GDP. The same number will tell you that today, and 80% will tell you that they believe business prioritises profits over fair wages or indeed safety of workers. We must change the business model. That will change the demand base. It will help grow the economy. So the I words I want to see are wages or income, which is wages and social protection, investment, absolutely, and of course inequality. If we get it right, it will mean inclusiveness. So the G20 is a critical debate this year for the world's leaders. What kind of economy are we going to have? More of the same and failure for the people, or indeed do we see the courage to renovate the global economy and realise the ambitions that the Turkish government's put on the deck?
Sean, thank you. funny you mentioned the word business, because that leads us to Phil. Phil O'Reilly represents the businesses in New Zealand, many of them global, of course. I'm not going to ask if you agree with those comments, but I do want to get a sense of where you stand on this particular topic and where the heart is, so to speak.
Sure. So if you want my personal view, I grew up in New Zealand, which takes inclusion reasonably seriously. You know, it's had a welfare state in New Zealand since the mid-30s. And I'm a poster child for social mobility. I was the first person in my family to wear a suit to work, and I'm certainly the first person in my family to do as much of this stuff as you've seen. So I'm a poster child for a relatively meritocratic society and social cohesion and social inclusion. But you can take a quite mercantilist view about this, I think, from a business perspective and still get to the same place. So I think it's quite important to run several arguments at this for the various audiences who are going to buy into it, depending on where they start. So you can run an argument about the importance of inclusive growth, because it's inclusive growth that we're after. Both of those words are quite important. Growth that's inclusive growth. You can run an argument around social cohesion. You can definitely run that, because without social cohesion you can have trouble in your business. You can run an argument about social mobility and everybody on board. And what's very clear to any business person who thinks about these things sensibly, certainly any OECD economy, is successful businesses need successful communities and vice versa. You're simply not going to be able to be a successful in business unless you're based in a successful community and that they feel a stake in your success. Otherwise, your business model is going to be at risk. So you can make all of those debates, and you can even make quite a mercantilist debate about this. You can say, I want more people to be better off because better off people buy things and invest in things and so on. So you can make a variety of arguments, all the way from the social justice arguments, all the way through to the mercantilist arguments, and they all seem to they all end up, from my perspective, as saying inclusive growth is actually a much more sensible idea than winner takes all growth. So that's a personal view, but it's also, I think, a very logical view that you can take from a whole variety of perspectives.
All right. Phil, thank you. Martin Wolf, you've gone on the record a number of times. I'll let you say in your own words, why is this issue important to you? You have been a long-time celebrated financial writer, in fact, arguably one of the most celebrated, at least in our generation. I think the audience would like to know whether you feel this is relevant to businesses, the stock market, the economies, and if we're on the right track.
You were been asking, first of all, thanks. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks for the question. You asked a sort of personal question, so I'm going to answer it very, very briefly. To me, economics is about the conditions under which there is widely shared prosperity. So that's why I became an economist. However unsuccessful we may be, that's why I became an economist nearly 50 years ago. Terrifying. And so it continues to be of interest to me, overwhelming interest. So that's the personal, but there's something else which has been very animating to me in my life. I've mentioned this in books, so it's quite important to me. My parents were both refugees from Nazi Europe, and to me it's always been clear that the reason for the catastrophe in Europe, or at least the trigger for the catastrophe in Europe, was total economic collapse and totally misguided policy making. And that has always been of interest to me, and I have to say I never thought I'd live through it, but I have.
Martin, thank you. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for that introduction about yourself and why this issue is so important. I have some housekeeping notes I must do. You guys know about the Wensbly, the Weasembly, housekeeping notes via the OECD Info app. Click on the Connect icon if you haven't done it already. We are OECD Blue, and you can ask questions also via Twitter as well with the hashtag. I like to call it pound. It's pound OECD Blue. You may ask questions via that or via the app, and apparently you can SMS us as well. If you don't have the number, ask one of the young folks here who has that. And I believe, do we have the question of the day, so to speak, up there? Where's my guiding light? The question of the day. Do we have that up? It's an easy question. Here it is. And you can vote. But the question of the day: is the G20 capable of delivering on all of its commitments? I know it's a broad question, but I think you can interpret it as you wish. But I think it's a fair question as well. Is the G20 capable of delivering on all of its commitments? So let me continue. And Gabriela, let me start with you. Is the G20 capable of delivering on all its commitments, and why? And also, you know, look, let's be honest, you talked to many, many influential people at the G20. There are some behind-the-scenes discussion, I'm sure you guys have, that they discuss what actually works and what doesn't work. I would like to, first of all, solve inclusiveness in 30 minutes, so please help me. But realistically, I would like to walk away from this with something positive. I want to walk away with things that work, things that we can share with our friends around the world, whether you're in the developing world or you're in the developed world. We all want to do the same thing, which is to include more people in this era of prosperity that seems to be uneven. Gabriela?
You will never get a negative answer from the OECD, and not next to the Turkish presidency. No, the reality is that I think the G20 is a work in progress. I believe that it's a very new organization. It's very recent that it was confirmed at the leaders level. But I believe that they have a very good track record of some achievements that probably gone unnoticed due to the very not very bright economic outlook. But the fact is that we should always remember that they avoided the worst. We should remember that they avoided protectionist measures on trade and investment to explode. And actually, they ask international organizations, they're not reinventing the wheel, because it's very easy that when you get these new structures to try to do everything by themselves and create brick secretariats, what they do is they ask the organizations to take a hard look at the issues. And we're following up in the measuring the protectionist measures on trade and investment. And they created a very interesting body, which is the Framework Working Group, that is looking at the policies that countries commit to deliver and are trying to implement. There is some very important constructions that are being advanced, and these are not yet commitments, but something that gathers the group together is their revamping of the tax international rules. I feel that this is going to provide another perspective in terms of how, related also to inequality, because you will have those that need to pay their fair share of taxes, paying it and not hiding behind. But the other point is that the G20 is also trying to organize monitoring systems, and we are glad to be part of those monitoring systems. Talking about inequality, one of the main conclusions of our reports is that it has also a gender perspective, and that by bringing more women into the labor force and by providing girls with the opportunity to go for science, technology, or mathematics, we actually can boost growth. And so they committed to a target, and I feel there are not many institutions that go for targets, so that's very brave. 25% more women in the labor market by 2025, and they have asked us to follow through. So I think that's good news. The other aspect was another numerical target, the 2% additional growth in the Brisbane Summit. And they are also asking us to try to assess and quantify how much of the commitments, and I can tell you this is a very heavy exercise, because when countries come to you and make a very general statement that they're going to improve the educational systems of their country, you are like, yes, but I cannot measure that. What is that? So does it mean that you're going to be training your teachers, or does it mean that you're going to be investing in equipment, or does it mean? So we narrow down the kind of commitments that they're putting together. It's important to have the political message, to say that I'm going to revamp the education system, but to link it to an exercise that makes it quantifiable and that allows the international organizations that are asked to follow up the possibility of measuring it and enter into a conversation with the countries to say, well, I don't think that adds too much, you know? Why don't you try better? It's very helpful. And the other part is that, remember, the Turks got the 3 I's, and the 3 I's include implementation. And I feel we are in a world that we like political messages, but we like more the tools to really check that the commitments are being delivered. So I am positive. I think that it's a complicated setting, and they have evolved. I mean, I remember when I was in the Korean summit, they were fighting, and I won't name names, but one country was saying, I want qualitative targets, and other was saying, I want quantitative targets, and it was a never-ending discussion.
Wait,
now
if there's a
have
fight, I think we do want names.
No, I leave it there. I think that we now have quantitative indicators to measure progress.
All right, thank you very much. Let's talk to your friend, Undersecretary Dogdas. Can you give us an example from a government level? A lot of people accuse governments of being bureaucratic, it takes too long, difficult to measure, or that some of them don't want to be measured in terms of progress. Give us an example of maybe one initiative that you have seen undertaken that has been successful, that you believe could be deployed in other countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this is a hard question, I mean, to exemplify, but for G20, I think that the awareness of the need of structural reforms is very clear. So that why do we know? Because, I mean, there are 1,200 commitments on structural reforms. So there's a demand over there. So how we implement, it's another issue. So in my own country, we prepared about 25 transformation area attached with the 1,500 action plan on that. So that every country aware of the needs for the implementing structural reform. On this, there are some political issues. Every country has some political issues, how they implement the issues. So that's why it should be country-owned and country-led progress. What I saw, what I have seen today, that all countries have some eagerness to implement these structural reforms. But what kind of outcome we will have after getting the information from all G20 members countries, and then the ask from OECD and the IMF to have an impact analysis for the structural reforms that already implemented and on the agenda of the implementation. So it is very crucial that we need a credibility for G20 to have an accountability report. So it is not a shortcut solving problems, but we have to monitor each other so that the accountability report for monitoring these commitments is quite important. So that the how we see that they are on the track, that we are on the track. In September, the first report that we will get, and then the evaluation in Leader Summit in Antalya in November. So I cannot say anything for the time being, but getting the report from the IOs for the implementation and monitoring, and the outcome of the report will be very important.
Okay, thank you very much. Keep us posted on the report. I believe we have an update on the poll, correct? Right, you're flashing a card at me. What do we have? The Assembly poll again? Here we go. Don't anger her. Is the G20 capable of delivering on all of its, maybe it's the all. I think it's a lot. You guys have a lot going on. It may be fair, right? 75% no. I feel like we should have another question. I hate to even go ahead. We should have had more questions, but okay, you keep voting. Maybe you can change your votes. Maybe you might change your vote by the end of this show, right? You never know. Phil, right? You're a business guy. People change their minds all the time, right?
Well, let me agree with the 75. Actually, I shall disagree with the 75, but I understand what they're trying to say. The short point is the G20 capable of delivering on all of its commitments? Probably. Will they? No. And I don't get too depressed about that, because that's politics. You know, there's a difference between leaders turning up in Brisbane or somewhere and then going home and getting it done. So I understand it's always a bit lumpy and always a bit difficult. So to me, I think Gabriella's absolutely right. What I think we've got to do is concentrate on building systems of accountability, hard data, that actually gets people to agree to do things and then go away and do them. And inevitably that will mean they will tend to agree to do less. And I'm okay with that, so long as they go and execute, and so long as they've got the right kind of direction in place. So I don't feel depressed about the G20 process. It's a thing that's in development. And I'd also say the business community is learning about this too. We've had the B20 process, the Business 20 process operating here over the last few days, and again tomorrow on global value chains. And the business community sometimes has a bad habit of saying, you know what you should do is you should improve access to finance for SMEs. Okay. Well, how would you think? You know, so I think it's over to us in the business community to also get quite crunchy with governments to say, here's 3 things you could do, executable things you could do. And I'm seeing through the Turkish B20 process, I'm seeing much more of that play out. So I think we're learning as well. And the other point I think is important, just before Sharon says it, is I think it's quite important that as much as possible the L20 and the B20 can agree on stuff, even if it's at relatively high level, so that the politicians have a view about what's safe to play. And the more we can agree stuff, the more the politicians will say, well, I can really jump into that because nobody's going to disagree with me.
As chair of the Business Association, I do have a business question for you. We often talk about workers' wages, and there has been an interesting debate that stretches from Europe to Asia and even to the Americas now. More recently, McDonald's and Walmart's gotten into the game about, well, what is a reasonable minimum wage? Should we have a minimum wage? And from a global perspective, I'm just curious, do you have a viewpoint on what an appropriate minimum wage should be and how should that be calculated?
It's always going to have to be done at national level. You just can't decide there's a global minimum wage, or I don't think you could logically achieve that outcome. But the other point I make about minimum wages is minimum wages operate as part of a framework of other things that you do in an economy. Social protection floors, skills policy, activation of employment for women, girls, immigrants, young people, people with a disability, others at the margins of the labour force. Lifelong learning is another important part of this, infrastructure development. So minimum wages is I think, an unhelpful concept when you simply talk about it alone as if it is some sort of solution. Actually, what you want is minimum wages to be, if you've got them, is to basically have them as a safety net. You want people to move off them quite rapidly if you can, and sometimes that's problematic, but that's what you're after in terms of good policy making. That's largely about building skills, it's largely about building the right infrastructures and the right kind of innovation and so on, that kind of capacity in your economy. So to me, there's no one size fits all, and I think it's quite unhelpful to say that that's the nub of the debate. I actually, when you think about inclusion, in the context of growth, I actually think you've got a really juicy piece of fruit to work on. There's a million things you can do to work on an inclusive growth process that actually everybody will agree with. Do we all agree that we should make sure that healthcare is properly available to all members of society? Well, of course we do. I mean, I hope we all do. So, I mean, that seems to me to be an important thing that we can all agree on and move forward on. So I think it's quite important to have a debate that is as much based on agreement as possible rather than disagreement, because I think we can move forward much more rapidly when we do that.
I had the unfortunate honor to cover the financial disaster we've recently been through in 2007, and I watched it escalate from Bear Stearns to Lehman Brothers to New York City to the rest of America. Ultimately, that bled into Asia, and of course, as we know, Europe, and a number of investment banks and so on. I'm not worried about the banks. But we lost, I don't know the exact number, but an awful lot of jobs around the world. Working wages. even non-working wages jobs we lost. And we have seen since then, maybe in our history, the most incredible comeback of the economy. And I'm careful about that word because whose economy? Those with assets, right? We've seen the biggest rebound in asset prices probably in our history. I don't remember a time when stock markets doubled in 5 years. I don't remember a time when home prices doubled or tripled in 5 or 6 years, if you measure off the bottom of where we were when we were worried that ATMs wouldn't work. And look at us today. My question, Sharon, to you, many of those workers, whether they're organized or not, they suffered through the financial crisis. And I think there's a lot of folks out there who believe that the recent upswing in global economies or the rebound in global economies have not included those who desperately needed it the most. Maybe they're not as educated, and maybe they don't have all the skills necessary. Maybe they're on the fringe of sort of the working demographics. Whatever the reason might be, they have not participated as much as many people would have liked. And I think you only have to look at the ridiculous unemployment rate of the youth unemployment rate, and you can stop there, and that we can make a very good argument. But I do want to hear from you what needs to be done or what mistakes have been made.
Well, I'd first of all challenge you on the fact that the global economy's rebounded. I think the evidence is in from the economic outlook today. At best, to quote the report, it's muddling through. But any rebounding, as you call it, has been the assets of the wealthy. So you've seen the wealthy retain their assets or grow them. You've seen greater speculation, frankly, in the financial sector than before the crisis. So we're all very vulnerable one more time. And indeed, we've seen inequality grow. So the answer is very simply no. And, you know, Phil and I don't disagree on getting to the same point. We don't disagree on the fact that there are many options for reducing inequality, although I think you can narrow them to three. They are the income spectrum, they are social protection, they are minimum wages, and they are collective agreements. If we don't have a business model that can actually deliver $177 a month in Cambodia, or $250 in Jakarta, or $120 in Bangladesh, we're in trouble. And if you go to the US and you've got working people, to quote your Secretary of Labor, it's it's not acceptable that you have working people in one of the richest countries in the world who work 2 jobs or more to feed a family. So minimum wages have to be the basis on which you can live with dignity. It's that simple. That's a business model we can all get behind. When it's underpinned by social protection, as Phil said, that's a community business taxation framework we can all get behind. And so then when you've got that basic demand and businesses growing and profits growing, if you have a robust collective bargaining system, then you can build a middle class and demand expands, and so we all have some optimism. We've lost that optimism. That's why that figure of can the G20 deliver? The fact is we've lost the optimism to trust that institutions have the political will and the economic policies that will deliver. We've seen it before. We know the answers. But if we don't deal with wages, and frankly, this is the first panel I've heard them really debated on throughout the course of the week. We've had good debates on climate, good debates on the economic outlook, but wages, income, social protection, these are the pieces of the demand floor that are missing. And unless we see some of the income share loss, and remember it's been almost 10% over 30 years in not just the G20 or the OECD countries, but almost all countries. Unless we see some of that come back, we're frankly not going to see the optimism, the jobs, and the demand floor come back. I might just say, Gabriella reminded me of Korea. We have come some way. There's no doubt about that, because in Korea I remember having to educate the president of the country about the fact that economic growth didn't necessarily equate jobs, and certainly not decent jobs or formal jobs. But we've come a long way when now jobs and growth are seen as parallel ambitions, but we haven't yet seen the implementation, and that is a key word in the G20 this year, to give people hope that that's going to happen.
Sharon, thank you. Martin, to you. The OECD gives the global economy a B-. Great. Not that great. Although my parents would be happy if I got that in economics. Strengthening investment is key to improving the world's economy is the headline from the OECD. As you know, the banks are an important part of any macro type of investment that's made out there. You have gone on a record saying that, and I don't want to scare anybody, but he says another crash is possible in the financial markets. Just if you guys didn't know, Martin has said that. Feel free to elaborate on that and whether or not we are all naive to believe that investment would flow to the policies and to the things that we are talking about today, barring a financial crisis. Martin?
Thank you very much. Just a couple of comments. Unless people were being very subtle and were making precisely the distinction between capability and actual delivery of the G20 agenda, I simply can't understand who the 25% were. It's clearly 100%, because of course they're not going to actually deliver all their promises. But I have to say also, having just discovered that there are 1,200 structural reform commitments, and being modestly well informed and having no idea what they are, I'm not sure that might not be a very good thing, but I will be corrected, no doubt, on that at some point. It's absolutely scary. So I'm going to move away, and you invited me to, from the G20. Sharon's raised some fundamental issues, which I'm also going to leave, though I do disagree on some quite important ones. But on the central issue that is raised, I think we can probably all agree that a necessary condition for most of what we want in our countries, which are very different challenges, is growth. Let's assume it's a necessary condition, clearly not sufficient. The evidence on the correlation between rapid growth and rising standards of living is reasonably strong, though, as a necessary condition. And a necessary condition for growth is investment in both physical and human capital and knowledge. So the question you raise is central. Now, it's absolutely clear that major financial crises destroy this. And it's absolutely clear that the crisis we've had has destroyed it. I pointed that out many times. In the developed world, roughly speaking, our economies in the North Atlantic economies are about a sixth smaller than we would have expected them to be if they had continued to grow more or less in line with the pre-crisis rates, which, by the way, were not particularly fast. There wasn't a huge boom in the pre-crisis period. It turned out to be unsustainable, which is very worrying, but it wasn't a huge boom. So the losses here are colossal, a sixth of GDP. And that means that for most of our economies, average real incomes per head have been pretty close to stagnant or falling, despite recoveries. In the Eurozone, average GDP per head, for example, is now about 5% below, 5 or 6% below the crisis. So we have to turn that around. To do that, we have to invest a lot more. The financial crisis can destroy this, but the evidence we increasingly have is that the financial sector doesn't itself finance the investment that leads to growth. This is very, very important. It can destroy it, but it doesn't. The bank's role in aggregate in financing investment in our economies has actually been remarkably small outside housing. Because banks increasingly have become institutions whose main role is financing the purchase of existing property assets as a byproduct of our belief, rightly or wrongly, that everybody should own, or a lot of people should own their own houses. That's what banks actually do. The really interesting thing are two other sectors, government and the non-financial corporate sector. The non-financial corporate sector of the developed world, pretty well in every country, is now running large or enormous financial surpluses. That is to say, their returned earnings, their resources they have, vastly exceed their investment. They're providing resources. In the case of Japan, it's been about 10% of GDP for 20 years. So the really interesting question is, why aren't they investing? They don't need bank funding. They have the money. They're not investing. This is the biggest single puzzle, I think, in our economies. And the second one, of course, is government, and I've made this point many times, and I think it fits with what Jeff Sachs must have been saying in the previous panel. Governments should be looking at their balance sheets, not just at the liability side, the debt side. They become debt fixated. I'm afraid in an earlier part of this crisis, the OECD supported that, and the OECD was wrong. We do live in a world of unbelievably low real interest rate, 0 to negative, very long term. The governments should also be investing. So I think we should look at non-financial corporate sector. What is holding them back? Why aren't they investing? And at the governments. Governments should be investing. I'm not calling for large fiscal deficits for current spending, but large spending on investment is what is called for. And that will drive the necessary condition for our improvement, which is a really strong recovery from this very prolonged recession.
Martin, can I ask you a personal question? You mind?
You can ask me a personal. No problem to answer it.
If you could advise central banks, would you raise rates globally, from the US to the UK to Europe?
No, absolutely not.
Why?
Because I think I think the equilibrium real interest rate in our world at the moment is 0 to negative. I think that's actually an underlying real rate. It's not generated by monetary policy. And I think monetary policy has to set nominal rates at a rate which is consistent with equilibrium real rates. And now you can ask me the much more interesting question is, why are equilibrium real rates 0 to negative, which is really worrying. Really worrying. But that seems to me the reality. I've had lots of arguments with other economists about this, but I think our view is increasingly more obviously correct because it's lasted for so long. If these monetary policies were too loose, we'd start to see massive surges in spending and massive inflation. What we're actually seeing is that today there is no major developed country which actually is hitting its inflation target. The US is the only one that's even close to it. As long as that's the case, there's no case for raising rates.
All right, Martin, thank you. I want to get to some questions, both from the audience and also I believe we have questions online, so prepare your questions online. But before I get there, Gabriella, we spoke before this, and you pointed out something that is personally important to me, and that's the importance of education. In fact, somebody had a tweet about this. Let me see if I can find it. It says, question, hashtag, pound, blah, blah. G20 set the 2% growth target last year. Can the G20 set a youth employment target for all G20 countries? That's from a Mr. Winston Chan. The youth. We often talk about the access to education and the need to get through pre-K, K, and to begin the path to what most of us probably take for granted when it comes to the world of being knowledgeable. I think for a lot of developing countries, they may be even a challenge to get the access to the education. And for women, it's even worse. That said, for you, why is education perhaps, or could be, and maybe I'm wrong, the cornerstone of any precursor to discussion of youth unemployment? Does that have to happen first before we can even address the youth unemployment issue?
I actually started by saying that we have proof that growth is not only bad for social cohesion. I think that Phil mentioned that, and that's one very important point. It's bad for trust, it's bad for human beings, it's bad for everything, but it's bad for growth. And the way we have calculated why it's bad for growth has to do with the fact that the lowest, well, it's interesting because it's the lowest 40% It's amazing. Now we talk about the lowest 40%, and I saw a question talking about the middle class. Well, that's the squeezing middle class that is no longer going up, but going down. Is because these families, which come from a difficult socioeconomic background, do not invest enough in providing their children with the capacity for them to fulfill their potential. Because that's education, that's what education is all about. It's not just to be ready to read or write. It's because you will be able to fulfill your potential. And when you look at people that are doing fantastic things in music, in art, in science, well, it's because they have the chance and because they could have access to quality education. So the question here is, how do we move to a system that would really provide for that opportunity for everybody? And not what is happening in reality, that those that have the level of income that allow them to access good education will always be fine. They will have it. And then you go to good universities, you go to good schools, and even if you have problems, your parents can pay someone to come and teach you at home. So how do we create a system that would not put it in the families, but put it for the whole system, the institutions, the business, the government, to allow for this access to education? And that's why we speak about skills, because all these low-income groups that did not access quality education arrived to the labor market and find precarious jobs, forget about continuing to try to improve your own capacities to contribute to the economy. And then, so that's why this is the most important thing, and that will help us to stop people accumulating disadvantages. And this is the problem, because in the past, and this is what is more scary, that we don't have this mobility by saying, well, if I study hard, maybe I will make it in life. No, because it's not happening. Social mobility is not happening. So my recommendation, and I don't know if the G20 will do it or not, because I agree on something. I'm not always agreeing with Martin, but I agree in the fact that, yeah, there are too many commitments. But if there is something that all the countries should be doing, is to invest strongly in early child care education. Really, to put there all the efforts, higher education people will arrive. And then you support those that doesn't have the means to get there. But in reality, those are the most advantageous segments. But investing in children, investing in those children that are before the formal education is the most important equalizer that I think of. And that's something that everybody would need.
I think there are many people in this room that would agree with that, including many moms.
You can't argue with Gabriella. I'm a teacher by trade, so, you know, I'm desperately dedicated to education, public education, free education for all, and indeed the skills revolution. I think Phil and I would agree in our countries. We both promoted, you know, particularly through the 90s as our economies were restructured. But the children, the young people in Tunisia are educated. They're educated. They can't get jobs. So it's not a causal, it's not that it's in opposition. We have to do what Martin said. We have to drive the investment that will drive the jobs. So the biggest thing that the G20 can do is actually make sure that their commitment to infrastructure investment pays off. If they want the equality target for women in jobs to pay off, they need to invest in the care sector, and that's where Gabriella's right. Education, aged care, childcare, health, they're the areas that will enable women to actually participate. But if we don't grow jobs, then we can educate our children, but for what? Now, I wouldn't argue that education's not a good thing on its own, but it's not going to drive the economic reality we all want if we're not seeing the investment. So we have to do all of these things together, but the investment is the key. And I want to leave you with a figure for those who are depressed about the G20 not being able to deliver. We were quite optimistic when the finance ministers said that they would set a target of the 2% that Gabriella talked about above trajectory or above growth, expected growth. It finally seemed we had some, you know, some spine in the system, that we were going to look at policies to do that. Well, guess what? We're already about 1.7% behind the target. Why? Because we don't have the investment. There's no money being spent into an economy that needs 90 trillion in infrastructure, that needs investment in the care economy, that needs a whole range of injections of finance. And I'm with Martin, the money is there. It's a matter of how you spend it, where you spend it, and what the outcome you get from it in real time, jobs, income, economic demand is.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, I apologize, I'm going to truncate this very shortly because I know we're running behind schedule. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. Again, please prepare your questions, and I will do my best to deliver it to the right expert. Where should we start? You want to start there? Okay, we'll start in the back room with that gentleman, please. And please state your name and your organization, please.
My name is Jose Velasco. I'm from Mexico. Work for the Ministry of Economy. I would try to answer the question about education. I think, but at the same time, I will make the question for you all. The entrepreneurial education would be the answer, because if we do it in the low-level grades like kindergarten and primary elementary school, we could develop that entrepreneurial shift. It's not just education as the way we're doing it. Even in underdeveloped countries, this entrepreneurial education is working. Even migrants can learn to be entrepreneurs. So is that policy taken into consideration all those success stories that we know from different entrepreneurs in different countries? We can make this shift of education in order to promote entrepreneurial education rather than just traditional education.
List of hands. Who wants to tackle that one? Phil?
So I agree with you, and in fact, Sharon will be aware we've done some work at the International Labour Organization on this, demonstrating that in rural areas, for example, entrepreneurship amongst women and migrants is a big potential, because often they're excluded from more formal ways of starting businesses or becoming employed. So it's fantastic and valuable. And of course, I'm from business, so of course I'll support entrepreneurship as much as I can. It's not the answer, though. It's one part of the answer. And so we should turn our minds to it, and we should do everything we can to make sure that a lot of that's about market reforms, making sure that small businesses can start and can grow. But I guess the answer from the panel, and I suspect we're all agreeing on this, is the big issue is investment. Without investment, and let's take that women entrepreneurship in rural areas, for example, and let's say Anglophone Africa. Without investment in things like broadband or roads or ports or schools or all sorts of other stuff, you're simply not going to get entrepreneurship taking off in quite the right way. So I think it is a story about investment, and the B20 process for the Turkish presidency is working on some quite specific proposals, to Martin's point, about unlocking some of that government potentiality around public-private partnerships, around trying to get the right kind of structures available so that government and business can co-invest in some of this infrastructure. So I think if we have the right argument about that, then yes, of course, entrepreneurship important, but it's not an answer on its own.
Phil and I are going to bore everybody, because normally we'd have a much more lively debate. But I
disagree with you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, for form, we probably should. But on this one, he's right. But the challenge is also much more extensive than just saying we've got to educate people to be entrepreneurial. There are 40% of the global economy where people are, as Phil said, already making a livelihood with no formal structure at all. No minimum wages, no social protection, no rights, and often excluded from formalising their businesses. So actually the employers and the unions globally, we don't agree on everything around how to formalise the informal economy. But I tell you what, we have a unity ticket in a debate right now at the ILO. Because if we unlock the entrepreneurship, I think last time I spoke to your Labour Minister and your President, it was about 50 million workers in Mexico. It's 80% in some economies. Even in the G20, it's between 20 and in the case of India, 93% of people working in the informal sector. You lose a tax base, you lose the dignity of formal work. We don't build formal businesses that can access finance and grow into the $50 billion, $500 billion companies of tomorrow and employ people on decent work. So yes, obviously, no one's going to argue against education or entrepreneurial education, but it's there for the taking if we look at how we restructure our economies.
I don't understand why anybody has to ever work in hiding, but that's for another debate. Next question, please. In the back there. Do you have a mic? Or no? Ma'am, please.
I'm a former member of staff, OECD staff. And I wonder about when we think, say, about allocating investments to the right directions, what don't governments don't seem to worry to trying to do away with tax havens? Because we know that there are colossal amounts of money who escaped taxation, and which could be usefully directed to the right directions. I know many governments even profit of those tax havens, but when do they? I mean, is it this one of the declared targets of the G20 efforts?
Okay, excellent question. Very polite question. Who would like to tackle this one on the issue of taxes, tax havens, and really why they exist?
Well, I think that's, I like to think that that's one of the success stories of the G20, because at the OECD we spent only 2 decades discussing how we could have countries exchanging information for tax purposes, and it was impossible. And I think there were 40 agreements to exchange information by demand. It was completely dysfunctional. And I guess that it's because what you're saying and what the panel is saying in terms of the need to provide with the investments and channel resources to these very important enablers of productivity and growth, governments suddenly realized that this story could no longer work in that way, and they created the Global Forum, integrated now by 120 countries, and they have been now not only preparing to exchange information on request, because on request you almost need to find a picture of the crime, and that's impossible, but automatic exchange. And now we move to the other part, which is how do you ensure that everybody pays their fair share of taxes with multinationals, which were not doing anything illegal, but the reality is that our own rules were creating an environment where double taxation became double no taxation. So we are delivering on the rules, and we're delivering on the substance, and countries are agreeing. Very difficult discussions, of course. But I think that's something that proved that when you have the right format around the table and the right willingness by the leaders and the ministers to deliver, it can be done. And so you will need to watch for Antalya, because that's where the OECD is going to deliver all the action plans for the base erosion and profit shifting. And then, of course, implementation will be very important.
I wanted to get to one last question we have time for. I'll go with this side just to be fair, to be democratic. We went over here. Quick question, and I will try to get you a quick answer, sir.
My question is for Mrs. Ramos and for Undersecretary Mr. Douglas. I'm with the G20 Young Entrepreneurs Alliance. As we know, we did a study that 84% of young entrepreneurs expect to create jobs in the next 2 years. I'd like to have your take on it. Entrepreneurs need their government to remove barriers so entrepreneurs can thrive and create jobs. One of our ideas we want to submit this year is a multilateral startup visa in the G20 countries. And I want to have your take on that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your specific question one more time?
We propose the multilateral G20 startup visa for entrepreneurs so they can start their business in all G20 countries. As you know, Chile, New Zealand, Australia, in the UK, they all have a startup visa, and that helps entrepreneurs. As you know, our economy, our global economy right now becomes more and more global. So I want to have your take on that, because it was one of the measures we proposed this year.
My apologies. I'll ask for brief comments from both. Mr. Undersecretary?
Yeah, I think that in G20 agenda there is nothing on this issue. so that the engagement group has some proposal to get this issue on the agenda, and then the presidency dealing with the other stakeholders, then get the issue on the G20 agenda. But the G20 agenda, for the time being, and the working plan, we don't have that issue. So in September or so, we are getting the feedback from the engagement groups, so that we are going to deal with these issues on the next presidency as the leaders committed. So that the only thing I can say that your proposal via the engagement groups will be taken on G20 agenda.
Okay. Very quickly. Phil, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I've heard this idea bouncing around a bit about the idea of allowing young entrepreneurs much more freedom to move between markets. My sense is that's actually a really good idea in principle, because the way entrepreneurship works is people say, oh, it's on the web. Well, no, it's not. You still need to talk to people, and you need to be in a coffee shop or a bar or a restaurant kind of working it out and you know, rubbing up against each other and so on. So the idea of allowing mobility for that particular group of people would need some work about how you make sure it's kept safe, of course, but it's a good idea in principle. And my encouragement is, sure, try and get it on the G20 agenda, but don't just stop there. Try and get a country doing it, because what will happen is if it works for one country, others will compete with it. So I just encourage you to keep the idea. I think there's quite a bit of sense in that idea done well.
We're okay, leave it there. Thank you very much. Look, I apologize we started a few minutes late, which means we should end so you can enjoy the evening. On behalf of the OECD, I'm Philip Yen. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of all of our esteemed speakers, thank you for your time. I'm sure they'd be happy to stick around for a few minutes.